All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to this workshop. Welcome to those who are here in person, and welcome to those who will be watching the recording later. My name is Tania. I'll introduce myself a bit later. But first of all, I would like to really express my gratitude for you for taking the time to prioritize yourselves, to prioritize your well-being, to invest into this topic of self-care. I know that many of you work in very fast-paced, demanding environments, and I know how hard it can be to actually prioritize self-care. So how about you just take a moment to acknowledge yourself for prioritizing this time for your well-being today. It's not always easy to find time for yourself, and yet here you are. So maybe you can just take a moment to connect to a sense of gratitude towards yourself for making this time today. And also, we'll be talking about self-care during the upcoming workshop. So maybe before we dive in, you can also check if there is something you would like to grab to take care of yourself during the upcoming 2 hours. Maybe a drink, or maybe a plaid, or something else that could support you in taking care of yourself. Or maybe you will just feel like adjusting your posture slightly or moving a bit. And also, I would like to invite you to have a pen and a piece of paper handy, because there will be moments where I will invite you to reflect on some questions. And while you are doing this, let me share my screen with the presentation that I have prepared for you today. I hope that you can see my screen. Yeah, perfect. So today's workshop is called Deep Self-Care for Sustainable Well-Being in Humanitarian Work. And a big thanks once again to CoCreate Humanity for this opportunity. And let me start with a quick overview of the workshop structure and what we're going to do today. So we'll start with a 1-hour presentation where I'll introduce myself and my work, where we'll talk about self-care, the key beliefs we may hold around this topic, and I'll also incorporate short practices in this 1-hour session. After this, we'll take a quick break for you to stretch, grab some water. And after the break, there will be a longer guided practice and a Q&A session that will take around 50 minutes. So I invite you, if possible, to keep your camera on and mute your mic during this first hour. But I really hope for this first hour to be interactive as well. And I'll invite you to share some thoughts, some reflections in the chat. Please feel free to do so. It's very welcome. And I also want to remind that I will be offering practices during the first hour, during the second hour. Hopefully all of them will be accessible, quite easy, but I really want to highlight that none of these practices is mandatory. Everything is optional. So please participate in a way that feels right for you. If you don't feel like doing something today, of course, it's completely okay. Just notice, observe what feels right. And we are talking about self-care. So please be mindful of ways in which you could take care of yourself during this session today. If you feel like you want to stretch or to stand up or to grab a cup of tea, please do so. Okay, so that's all I wanted to share about the structure. And before we go any further, I would just like to guide you through a very short self-care practice, just a very quick check-in with ourselves. So I would like to invite you to sit comfortably, just check if there is anything you would like to adjust to make yourselves even more comfortable. Letting your body settle in a way that feels supportive. Maybe for a couple of moments, if it feels comfortable, you can close your eyes or maybe just soften your gaze, keeping your gaze away from the screen for a couple of moments. And take a deep breath in And let it out slowly. Maybe once again, deep in-breath. And a long, soft out-breath. Now, please take a moment to notice, how is your body feeling right now? Is there any tension, tightness, discomfort somewhere? And is there something you could do to take care of yourself right now? Maybe a small adjustment in your posture, stretching, or maybe just giving yourself permission to relax a little bit more, to feel supported by this surface on which you are sitting. Take your time, there is no rush. Just taking your time to tune in, to respond to your needs, however small or simple they may be. And now you can take one more deep breath in and out. If your eyes were closed, you can gently open them. Maybe take a look at the people on the screen. Notice who is here today. Notice that we're together participating in this workshop, sharing this space, maybe acknowledging the presence of each other with a gentle smile or a nod. All right. And now I would like to take a couple of minutes to introduce myself and my background a little bit more. So my name is Tania Shybko. I'm originally from Belarus. I've been quite a nomad for a big part of my life. I'll tell you more about this. And I'm now based in France, in Nantes, northwest of France. I have a background in international cooperation, international relations, and I've spent around 13 years working on different team management, program management positions in crisis and conflict settings. I've held various positions such as program coordinator, country director, emergency response manager in various international NGOs across countries such as South Sudan, Cameroon, the Central African Republic, Iraq, Ukraine, Haiti, and others. So I've moved around the world quite a bit. And now I work as an independent consultant in the field of project evaluation, project design. I do a bit of training on various topics related to the project cycle management. And in parallel, I have also decided to train as an embodiment coach and as a mindfulness teacher. And the reason why I decided to do that is because while doing this work, while working in all these contexts and locations with heavy demands and a lot of pressure, I've firsthand experienced the challenges of humanitarian aid work. And at one point, I experienced burnout, which led me to reevaluate how I approach well-being and self-care. And this inspired me to explore tools that could support my well-being, and guided my decision to eventually become a trainer and to support others using the same tools. And I guess some of you might be curious, what is embodiment coaching actually? What does it stand for? I could talk about it for a long time, but in summary, it's a holistic approach to coaching that integrates the mind and the body, that takes into account what happens at the body level. And it's based on the idea that the mind and the body are deeply interconnected. What happens in the mind affects the body and vice versa. And it's something that you don't have to take for granted. It's something you will explore today through a couple of practices, and I'll be happy to discuss it in more detail during the Q&A session at the end. And today I'm passionate about sharing my expertise and my skills with humanitarian professionals, helping them to navigate stress, to prevent burnout, to enhance their resilience. And I've trained with a variety of teachers whom I'm crediting here on the screen, and many others as well. And their teachings have inspired the workshop and the practices I'll be sharing with you today. And now a couple of words about why this workshop exists, why I decided to create this workshop. First of all, as I've mentioned, I have worked for several years in high-stakes environments, and I noticed, of course, that these environments are very demanding emotionally, physically, and there was a lot at stake. And actually, as aid workers, we do tend to operate in these high-pressure, high-stake environments. And having to deal with this pressure and this stress leads to an increased risk of burnout, compassion fatigue, emotional exhaustion. And for me, this really underscores the importance of self-care in our specific sector of work. Having said that, I have also noticed that there are quite a lot of misconceptions around self-care, quite a lot of beliefs that are not necessarily true among humanitarian aid workers, but not only, among people in general. Some of them are specific to the aid sector, some of them are more generic. For example, something like self-care is a luxury, something we cannot afford, or self-care is selfish. And it's something we'll discuss together in more detail later during the workshop. Sometimes aid workers can hold the belief that we are here solely for others and that we cannot take care of ourselves while doing our work, which sometimes can make it difficult for us to prioritize our own needs. And in addition to that, based on my experience and one of my colleagues with whom I've talked, very often all these challenges are exacerbated by an unsupportive organizational culture. Sorry, I noticed that I have switched accidentally my lab. Here I am. Oh, sorry. I'll check it later. It's going to be okay like that. So yeah, an unsupportive organizational culture, which promotes a culture of overwork and sometimes pushing ourselves to the limit is seen as a kind of badge of honor. And on top of that, many organizations lack structures, cultures that really support self-care. And this unsupportive organizational culture can make us feel even more disconnected from our own well-being and from self-care. And I am deeply convinced that caring for ourselves is deeply essential to sustaining our ability to serve others over time. And it's not only about productivity and making sure we can fulfill our obligations, our duties. I think it's also about ethics. And I don't think we can truly care for others in a meaningful and sustainable way if we are neglecting ourselves in the process. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, I had to pay the high price for discovering that actually I have to prioritize self-care. As I've mentioned, I have experienced burnout myself and reached a point where, as mentioned on the image on this slide, I just felt tired of being tired. And it really forced me to reevaluate how I approach well-being and self-care. But enough of me talking about why I decided to do this workshop. I would be curious to hear from you now. Maybe you can just take a minute to write in the chat, what brought you to this workshop today? Why are you curious about this topic of self-care? Someone is saying, I'm always curious about the topic of self-care for professionals as a psychology student, and it inspired my current thesis. Yeah, it's definitely quite a rich topic to explore in the psychology studies as well. Thank you. Another person is sharing, I know that I have to self-care, something I didn't know some years ago, but actually practicing self-care is different from knowing it. Yeah, for sure. And when I feel fatigued, it's especially hard to even think of what the tools are. Yeah, thank you so much for saying that. I totally agree. Indeed, it's the same for me. When I feel tired, fatigued, I don't even remember that I have these tools and practices in my toolbox that I can actually apply to take care of myself. And yeah, and we'll talk about this later. Self-care is all about practice. It's really about remembering to apply the tools that we have on a daily basis. Thank you so much. And the second question I would like to ask you to explore is more of an exploration question. And I don't want you to think too much. I just want you to observe and notice what is the first response that comes up when I invite you to finish the sentence, self-care is. Just don't think for too long. Notice your first reaction, the first thought that comes when I invite you to finish the sentence. Maybe a thought or a feeling. And yeah, if you can also drop it in the chat, it will be great. Someone is saying, listening to yourself. I love that. Thank you. Somebody says self-care is warm and fuzzy and also hard. Wow, it gives me goosebumps. I think I feel quite in the same way. I feel it's something warm, pleasant, but also hard. And maybe, I think for me, when I tune into this sentence, the first thing that comes up for me is self-care is optional. Self-care is pleasant, but optional. And it's interesting to see that based on what you shared in the chat, there is something positive that comes up. Self-care being warm, fuzzy, self-care being about listening to yourselves, but also something maybe slightly more negative about self-care being hard. And it's quite the same for me. When I reflect on that, it's definitely a mix of different feelings and experiences. Self-care is nice, but self-care is maybe optional, something I shouldn't prioritize because I have other priorities. And I would also like to invite you to take a minute to reflect on another question. Was there a time, a moment, a situation in your life when you felt guilty about prioritizing your self-care? Or maybe unsure whether it was a priority for you? Maybe you can just raise your hand on your screen to confirm that you maybe had this kind of moments in your life, yeah, or a nod. I see some of you nodding, smiling, yeah. And maybe you can take a moment to reflect, what were the thoughts or beliefs that were behind these feelings? Why did you actually feel guilty or unsure? Did you think that something else was a priority? Or did you think that you didn't deserve self-care in that specific moment? And if you feel like sharing in the chat, you are very welcome. Or otherwise, you can keep these reflections private for now, whatever feels right for you. I'll just give you a couple more seconds to reflect on that. Yeah, people are writing in the chat that yes, self-care was hard sometimes, and sometimes people felt guilty or unsure because when the lives of others are at risk and you have taken on the task of helping them, the time pressure is very real and it doesn't feel like there is time for self-care. Yes, I can definitely relate to that. Working in the field of humanitarian aid, the time pressure is very often there, very often very concrete, and often gave me as well the impression that there was no time for self-care. Another person is sharing, I felt like I wasn't being useful to others if I wasn't focusing on myself for a while. If I was focusing on myself for a while. Yeah, sometimes indeed, and we'll discuss it later during the workshop, if we choose to focus on ourselves, it can lead to this feeling or to this belief that we're not there for the others, that we're not being helpful, we're not being useful. Another person shares, some self-care activities are directly at odds with activities to help others, at least in the short term. Yes, I agree with that. Sometimes it can be this way, or at least it can feel this way. And I think it's one of the important reasons why self-care can feel so hard for us as humanitarian aid workers, because there is this perceived conflict between being there for the others and taking care of ourselves. And I would also like to guide you through a more embodied practice to also explore your beliefs, your experiences around self-care through the body. And maybe you'll notice that something else is revealed through this exploration. Maybe it reinforces what you have already shared. And I would like to guide you through a very simple practice called the self-care pose. Before I guide you through this, let me first explain what we'll do and why. So I'll start with saying that in the embodiment approach that I practice, we work, among other things, with poses, with certain body postures that represent certain feelings, qualities, states, for example, care, self-care, rest, letting go. And these poses can help us connect with certain qualities, experiences in a very physical, tangible way. It can be an entry point to explore certain states, certain quality, not only by just thinking about it, but also through connecting with it through the body. And it's also an interesting way to notice whether something feels comfortable, uncomfortable, familiar, unfamiliar. So if it's okay for you, let's begin. And maybe just for you to see me better, I'll stop sharing my screen for a second, just to make sure you can properly see myself. So I would like to invite you to, again, to check if you are comfortable in the position that you're currently in, just allowing your body to settle a bit more. And we'll basically be doing a self-hug, just with slightly more instructions. So I would like to invite you to stretch out your hands, your arms, and place one hand snugly on your ribs and the other on the opposite shoulder, creating a gentle self-hug. And you can let your big toes touch each other and just tilt your head slightly towards the upper hand. And maybe if it feels comfortable, close your eyes or soften your gaze, turning your attention inwards as if you're holding yourself with care, with gentleness, tenderness. Maybe you'll want to add a gentle sway, or maybe a soft stroke along your arm, or maybe even a sound like or gentle soft sound. And you can also explore what is the quality of the squeeze of the hug that feels good for you right now. Does your body need something soft, light, some delicate touch? Or maybe something more firm, a gentle squeeze? And as you keep holding this pose, as you keep turning your attention inwards, just notice how this feels. Does it feel pleasant? Does it feel comfortable? Or maybe not, which is also completely okay. No judgment regarding any experience you might have. Could you stay in this pose for a long time? For 10 more minutes, for example? Or do you already want to come out of it? And also, where in your life does this sensation already feel familiar? Are there areas of your life where you have a sense, oh, I know this feeling already? Or maybe even, I do this already. And you might also notice a longing for more of this kind of care, self-care in your life. And maybe you can reflect, where could you be a little bit more tender, a little bit more gentle with yourself? And just stay here for a couple more seconds, or one more deeper in-breath, out-breath. And when you are ready, slowly, gently release the pose. And take a moment to notice how it actually felt for you to come out of this pose. Was there maybe a sense of relief? Or did you want to stay in this pose longer? And if it felt slightly uncomfortable in any way, remind yourself that it's completely okay. This pose can sometimes evoke emotion, feel a little bit vulnerable. And sometimes you can also struggle in accessing this quality of self-care. Sometimes it's easier for us to imagine that we give care to others or receive it from another person as opposed to giving it to ourselves. So take your time to gently come out of it. And I would be curious if it's okay for you to hear, maybe you can drop a line in the chat, how it was for you. What did you notice in your body, in your emotions, maybe in your thoughts? Did you feel comfortable doing this, or maybe slightly uncomfortable? Did it feel familiar or unfamiliar? While I'm sharing my screen again, I would be happy to hear from you. How was it? And I hope that you can see my screen again. Someone is saying warm and fuzzy, and I didn't want to come out. And someone is saying it was nice and peaceful. I'm happy to hear that you had a nice and peaceful experience and it was warm and fuzzy. And what do you think it reveals about yourself and about what you might need in your life right now? Maybe in a way, if you felt that like you didn't want to come out, are there areas of your life where you might be deprioritizing self-care, or you might be longing for more self-care? Just a reflection question for you. In which areas of your life might you need more of this quality? Yeah, it highlights the need to hit pause sometimes. Someone is sharing in the chat. Indeed, when I tap into this quality of self-care through this pause, it's the same for me. I really realize sometimes how hurried and how rushed I have been and how good it is for me to just slow down. Thank you for experiencing this with me. And somebody is adding, maybe this indicates some serious fatigue, but I didn't even want to be the one putting in the effort to hug myself. I wanted a soft blanket to be wrapping me. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, indeed, actually, even hugging ourselves can feel like an effort sometimes. And maybe if it feels this way for you, you can actually indeed experiment with receiving a hug from a blanket. Maybe even now or maybe later today, you can go grab a blanket and actually wrap it around yourself, allowing yourself to feel this soft and warm embrace of the blanket without having to do anything, just receiving this soft hug from the blanket. Maybe something to experiment with if it resonates with you. And so today we're talking about self-care, but I think it's maybe a good idea to discuss what self-care actually is, because we might have different perceptions or different understanding around this concept. And actually, maybe you have noticed, most likely you have noticed that during the past years, self-care has become somewhat of a buzzword, at least a very popular term in mainstream culture. It appears in advertising, on social media, in lifestyle blogs. Everybody's talking about self-care now. And I think in a way it's a good thing, because it helped raise awareness on the importance of self-care. But I think it also led to some misconceptions about what self-care actually is. And I actually notice when I think about self-care, what comes up for me very quickly are images of people having spa days, or maybe having some luxury skincare, or maybe going on an expensive retreat somewhere. And there is nothing wrong with that, of course. And while all these things can be enjoyable and nourishing, I think they can be sometimes quite focused on consumerism, and maybe result in a tendency to overlook some of the deeper aspects of self-care. Yeah, I see some of you nodding. So today I wanted to offer you some of the definitions of self-care that I have found. And maybe when you hear me share that, maybe you can observe which ones do actually resonate with you most. And the first one, quite conventional, let's say, is self-care is anything that you do deliberately to take care of your mental, emotional, and physical health. I would say this definition is quite broad and highlights that self-care is something multifaceted, which includes mental health, emotional, physical. Another way we can define self-care is by saying that it's an act of reclaiming time, space, and energy to thrive rather than merely survive. And for me, this definition frames self-care as something empowering and shifts, I would say, the focus from basic survival to thriving, and highlights that self-care is not only about rest or recovery, but it's really about creating conditions for growth, for joy, for a sense of purpose in our lives. The third one, quite a short one, is self-care is how you take your power back. So I find that this definition is quite bold, maybe in a way, and it portrays self-care as a way to reclaim agency in our lives, I would say, particularly in the context where we could feel overwhelmed, overstretched, maybe disempowered. And the last one I wanted to share is by Audre Lorde, American writer and feminist, and you can see it on the screen. Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it's self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. And I would say, at least to me, this quote brings quite a radical perspective on self-care, challenging this stereotype that self-care is selfish, indulgent, it frames self-care as a necessary, maybe even revolutionary act, particularly for individuals, for groups who face systemic challenges. And in this way, self-care can even become an act of resilience, an act of resistance, and a way to sustain ourselves in the face of external pressure, of injustice. So I would say we can really look at self-care in different ways and find more depth in the definitions of self-care as we go. And I'm curious to ask, how does it land with you? And is there a definition that resonated with you most? And I'll maybe just share the previous slide again. Which one of those resonates with you the most? The first one, someone is saying, I like the imagery of the woman watering herself. Yeah, I do too. Thank you. I think for me, probably the one that resonates most is maybe the second one, the act of reclaiming, intentionally, deliberately reclaiming my time, my space, and my energy to thrive. I really like the word thrive. What do I need to have more purpose, more joy, more connection in my life? Yeah, I hope that for those who'll be watching the recording, you'll also find one that resonates with you. And now I would like to dive into the exploration of some of the beliefs we can hold around self-care. And you have mentioned some of those earlier in the chat, that self-care is not a priority for us as humanitarian workers because we are there for others, and it can be something selfish, and we don't have time for self-care. And I can also relate to these beliefs very strongly. Maybe a bit less so now, but for a long time, these beliefs were really parts of the way I functioned and I dealt with self-care. So today I would like to maybe challenge or at least offer some explorations of these beliefs. And I want to start with maybe the most common one, the one that you have mentioned in the chat and the one that I really experienced myself and so among my colleagues. I am, quote unquote, too busy for self-care. And I think it's completely understandable to hold this belief, particularly in the intense, fast-paced environments that we work in. And I think in humanitarian aid, we often fall into this pattern of chronically overfunctioning in a way, or being chronically busy, overworking, overextending ourselves, overgiving. And in a way, it can become a trap. And maybe even in a way, the system that we work in can even rely on our inability to take a step back and to take better care of ourselves. And also sometimes, at least for me, I often catch myself thinking, yeah, I will take care of myself, but later, when I'll have more time, maybe tomorrow, maybe next year, when I'll finish this mission or this project, or maybe when I'll have more money or something like this, I'll go on this retreat. Who can maybe also relate to that? Does anyone feel this as well sometimes? That self-care is something to be postponed for later, or not that much? But if you can relate to this belief that self-care is something that we are too busy for, I want to share a couple of reflection questions with you. And maybe you can just take a minute to reflect on all of them, or maybe just pick one that resonates most and keep some others for later. And the first one is, do you tend, or at least partially, tend to perceive self-care as something that requires long, time-consuming actions that don't really fit into your schedule? The second question is, are there activities that currently tend to take priority over self-care? And do you think that these activities are truly more important than self-care? The third question is, if you find yourself being constantly busy, how much of this sense of being busy is tied to your sense of self-worth? Do you tend to feel more valuable, more accomplished when your schedule is full? And if yes, what might it reveal about how you view yourself? And the final question is, have you ever experienced a time, a situation when neglecting self-care actually made you less effective and more stressed? And I will give you a minute to take a couple of notes if you want to do so, a couple of reflections on what comes up for you when you see these questions. Maybe one of them resonated with you more than the others. Yeah. If you feel like taking a moment to reflect and take some notes, I'll just pause for a second. If there is something you feel like dropping in the chat, it's of course very welcome. But if you feel like keeping it private for now, it's also completely okay, of course. A couple more seconds before I continue. And one of the messages I really wanted to share today, and that I found quite life-changing for me, is that I personally tended to believe for a long time that self-care required a big time-consuming effort, something that I didn't have time for today, maybe tomorrow. And with time, something that have really changed the way I relate to self-care was the fact of realizing that sometimes some very small practices that just take a couple of seconds can make a really big difference. And I'm sure those of you who are here today, those of you who will be watching the recording, you probably already have some of these tools in your toolbox. But today I wanted to share a couple of those with you as well, maybe as a reminder, maybe you'll find something new. And one of these micro self-care practices that I sometimes also like to call ninja practices, because they're very quick, very subtle, very effective, don't really require a lot of time. And one of the shortest practices I know, which I find really pleasant and quite effective for me, is what's called the physiological sigh. And if it's okay for you, I would like to invite you to try it together with me. Maybe once again, you can check if you're comfortable in the position in which you are right now. If you need to do something to make yourself more comfortable, to take care of yourself. And it's very simple. It's just taking a double inhale, inhaling once, then taking one more sip of air, and then making a long exhale with the sound, with a sound, yeah. And once again, inhaling twice. A soft sound on the exhale. And maybe once again. And if it feels good and enjoyable, you can maybe repeat it a couple more times. maybe with this image that when you say ha on the exhale, you just release some of the tension, some of the pressure, as if you were putting down a heavy backpack after a long hiking day. Hmm. When I do that, I notice that there is a sense of relief that comes through my nervous system, that this brings more relaxation, more ease. And I wonder how it is for you. Do you also feel the same? In a way, yeah. Notice some people nodding, maybe one final physiological sigh, again inhaling twice, filling our lungs to their full capacity, and long, soft exhale with an ah sound. Doesn't take more than a couple of seconds. Something is quite easy to practice at any time of the day. And there are many more of these micro self-care practices. I'll share some. Just notice and see what resonates with you, if anything. And I found all of them quite effective for me, particularly when I'm navigating very stressful, very busy periods. And sometimes just taking a moment to look out of a window, maybe listen to the sounds outside, to step outside for a moment to feel the sun or the wind on my skin, can already shift my state. Sometimes the micro practice of releasing the physical tension, just rolling my shoulders, stretching my neck, maybe shaking out my hands, and maybe will feel drawn to following along, maybe stretching your body a little bit. Again, doesn't require a lot of time, just a couple of moments, but can already shift the way we are and the way we feel. Maybe doing a micro self-compassion break. And maybe if you feel like following along, it's something we can do together right now. Maybe for a second, you can look away from the screen. Maybe put one hand on your chest, maybe the other hand on your belly, or wherever it feels good for you. And just silently say something kind to yourself. Anything that feels good. Maybe something like, I am doing my best. Or I deserve rest and self-care. Or any other kind, soothing sentence that comes up for you right now. And just noticing if anything changes when you do that. Allowing yourself to tune into this quality of touch, your hands touching your chest, your belly. Maybe gently smiling to yourself if it feels right for you. And when you feel ready, you can gently let it go and come back to the screen. And notice whether there is any difference in the way you feel after having done this short, quick practice. Another invitation you can explore is to maybe snack in a mindful way. When you eat something, maybe a piece of fruit, how can you really focus on its taste, its texture, really enjoying this moment of snacking and focusing on this single task? Maybe sometimes just taking some mindful breath, 3, 5 deep breaths, focusing on the sensation of the air entering and leaving your body. Maybe sometimes just as simple as closing your eyes or stepping away from the screen for a couple of moments. So some of the beliefs that can help us reframe this idea that we are too busy for self-care can be even small moments of self-care can make a big difference in how I feel and how I function. And by carving out time for self-care, we can prevent burnout, stay productive, healthy, energized in the long run. And finally, maybe we can remind ourselves that our well-being is as important as any other task on our to-do list. And I would like to invite you to reflect on the following two questions. Is there a simple, very quick act of self-care? Maybe you can pick one among those I have shared. Maybe you already have one in your toolbox. Which one could you commit to, even during your busiest days? Something you could do daily, or maybe even several times a day. And the key here is to really remember to do it. Very often we tend to forget. So how might you remind yourself to really uphold this commitment? Maybe by putting a notification on your phone or a post-it on your screen or somewhere else. Really remember to do this action consistently. And I'll give you a moment to reflect on that. Maybe take a note. And before we take a break, I would like to discuss one more belief. It is very common among aid workers, and yeah, before that, I just wanted to quickly share this quote that I really like, that whatever we do to support our self-care, even if it's just a small action, how can we act in a way as if what we do makes a difference? Because it does. And I'm really convinced that when sometimes these small actions feel maybe insignificant in the moment, how can we really keep prioritizing them to create a more balanced, resilient, fulfilled version of ourselves? And how can we remind ourselves that what we do influences the way we show up for others, for ourselves, of course, but also for others and for the world around us? I hope this quote resonates with you as well. And yeah, the second belief I wanted to explore with you today is that self-care is only about physical comforts, only about relaxation. Sometimes we think that self-care is about bubble bath or going to a spa or just doing something relaxing, which is true. But I think that self-care is way richer and way deeper than that. And I wonder how it is for you. And here are a couple of reflection questions I wanted to share. When you think about self-care, is there anything that comes to mind beyond physical relaxation? Do you think there is something else you should prioritize to meet your other needs, maybe for creativity, for play, for connection? I think self-care sometimes also implies saying no to certain things. So when was the last time you said no to something to protect your well-being? Maybe to your manager, maybe to somebody else. And when you choose to not say no to some situations, some obligations, some tasks, are there ways you might be harming yourself by choosing to not say no? And sometimes we tend to confuse self-care with numbing out and disconnecting ourselves from what we feel through mindless scrolling, or maybe binge watching something. So another question I want to offer you is, are there activities that you tend to turn to for comfort, for soothing yourself, that might actually leave you drained and disconnected? And if yes, what are they? And which activities actually truly nourish you emotionally, mentally, spiritually? And maybe other situations when you have to ask somebody for support in terms of self-care. Maybe there are things you need that you cannot do alone. And if it's the case, whom could you reach out to ask for support in terms of self-care? So I'll just pause here for a second to invite you to reflect on maybe one or a couple of questions that resonate with you most. Just give you a minute if you'd want to take some notes. I hope you found these questions inspiring, and I'm also looking forward to our discussion after the break. And a couple of thoughts I wanted to share on how we could potentially reframe this belief is by reminding ourselves that saying no to what drains us can actually be a powerful form of self-care. Sometimes we tend to forget about it, but self-care might sometimes require saying no to certain things. For me personally, at some point I realized that I had to take longer breaks between missions, that I tended to say yes too quickly to new commitments. So for example, I learned to say no to something that felt maybe premature or too intense. And it allowed me to make more space for resting between missions, and thus preventing burnout and better taking care of myself. I have also learned to say no to overwork. I'm now much better at this. Before I used to say yes to everything, all the tasks that came my way. And now I have learned to set way clearer boundaries around this. And for me, it's part of this deep self-care that I'm talking about. Is there something that drains you in a chronic way? And is there something you have to say no to? Then, as I said, sometimes we confuse some activities that drain us with self-care. So how can we remind ourselves that true self-care actually does nourish our body, our mind, even if sometimes it doesn't feel comfortable? Maybe sometimes we don't want to go for a walk or do some kind of physical activity, but in the long run, it will really nourish our self-care. So yeah, choosing something that supports our long-term well-being over short-term distractions. Is there a way for you to prioritize one action that could maybe support and nourish you in a very deep and profound way? So when you will be reflecting on the action points that you could implement, maybe you can reflect on what is the one thing you can say no to right now, a situation, an obligation, maybe something small, even if it feels hard, uncomfortable. And is there maybe an activity that you need to prioritize to better nourish your emotional or mental or spiritual well-being. And how can you approach it creatively, even if you're in the field in a challenging, restrictive environment? Maybe you can just find 5 minutes a day to listen to your favorite music and to just let your body dance when you listen to your favorite song, something I have been doing when no one was watching. So how can you be creative around your self-care, even in the most stressful and challenging environments, really carving out small moments for something that truly nourishes you? I remember how I ended up running in my 9 square meters room in South Sudan because I couldn't jog outside. It didn't feel very pleasant, but it still helped me to take care of my physical and even mental well-being because I really needed physical activity. So is there a small way that you could build in a new self-care practice into your daily routine, regardless of how busy you are? Something that really nourishes you. I hope these questions, these reflections inspire you and give you some ideas about the action points that you could implement moving forward. And I'll stop sharing my screen for a second. We'll soon move into a break, but for those of you who are watching the recording, before we stop the recording, I just wanted to quickly share the way you can reach out to me if you're interested to maybe in sharing your feedback or maybe discussing this in more detail. There are several ways to stay in touch, either by email and through my website. I'm also available on social media. And you can share your action points, share any questions you may have around this topic. I'm always open to discussing this with you. And I'm also open to diving deeper, either through one-on-one work or maybe in the framework of a group workshop. I do sometimes offer workshops on stress management, burnout prevention, well-being, like this one. So please feel free to stay in touch. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for watching the recording. If it's okay for you, we'll pause the recording now to take a break and dive into more practice.